One of the true breakthrough moments many new and even some veteran woodworkers experience is the day they discover how useful a marking gauge can be. Today's that day. Up until now, you may have had no idea what a marking gauge was, or you may have dismissed it as an old-fashioned tool that was made obsolete by the pencil. Boy, were you wrong. A marking gauge is an ancient tool that's designed around an ancient principle that remains a fundamental of woodworking today, that project parts should be fit together, not merely machined to match numbers on a paper. For example, a modern woodworker may wish to join this board to this one with a rabbet joint. Since he's working with standard 3/4 inch stock, he might take his ruler and place a mark 3/4 of an inch from the end of the board. And that's the width he cuts his rabbets. Then he has to do a bunch of sanding because the joint didn't come out flush. So what happened? His board may not have been precisely 3/4 of an inch thick. They rarely are. Or he may have misread his ruler and marked in the wrong place. His ruler may not have been precisely positioned right on the end of the board. His eyes may have prevented him from aligning his pencil point precisely with the marks on the ruler, and the thickness of his pencil line may have added more air. But what if he had used a marking gauge, which can be physically set to the precise thickness of the board itself, whether that's really 3/4 of an inch or 25/32 or whatever. The marking gauge references directly on the end of the workpiece, so you can't screw that part up. It doesn't rely upon your eyesight or your ability to align your pencil point with the scale on a ruler. And the mark produced by a marking gauge is far more accurate than a pencil line, both because of its fine width and because it can serve as a physical location for some cutting tools, such as chisels. There are many other uses for a marking gauge, and in this video, we'll discuss the different types of various gauges out there and ways that you may use them even if you favor power tools for most of your work. So let's begin by identifying the parts of a marking gauge so you know what I'm talking about as I use these terms throughout this video. These are all different types of marking gauges, and we'll discuss their differences later, but they all have a few things in common. The long skinny part is called the beam. The larger part that moves up and down the beam is called the fence. The sharp bit that does the marking is called the cutter. And as you will see, cutters can take various forms. This is a homemade gauge that I made myself. It has a pin type cutter, meaning a little round point, in this case it's just a nail, which scratches the wood to produce a line. These pin style cutters are very common, both in homemade versions like this and in many antique examples, such as this one from the late 1800s. The downside of a pin style gauge is while it seems to do a good job when marking with the grain, it can tear at the fibers when marking across the grain. And that can present a problem if you want to cut crisp joinery right up to your line. You must also take note of the point when you're setting the gauge. For example, let's say you want to set this gauge to the thickness of this board. I can't just pinch the board between the nail and the fence on the gauge because it's not the side of the nail that does the cutting. It's the point. I must put the tip of that point right on the edge of the board to set it properly. This gauge features a knife-style cutter. In fact, it's often called a cutting gauge, and it provides some clear benefits over that pin-type gauge. For example, the cutter may be removed and made razor sharp, which will sever the fibers cleanly, especially across the grain. With the bevel turned toward the fence, the knife shape produces a groove that perfectly fits the edge of a chisel for accurate, crisp joinery. With the flat side of the knife facing the fence, I can pinch a board between the two, making setup faster and very accurate. And a knife will also produce a finer line than a pin-type cutter. Traditionally, a pin-style gauge is considered best for marking with the grain, and a knife-style gauge is considered best for marking across the grain. But there is a third type of cutter that I think is superior to them both. This is a disc-style cutter, and it's my favorite type for several reasons. First, these discs may be kept razor sharp and can easily be replaced if they're damaged. It will cut cleanly both across the grain and with the grain. Because the cutter is on the end of the beam, and on well-made versions, the screw is countersunk below the surface of the cutter, you may set it by placing the fence on top of a board and lowering the cutter down to the bench top. I find this to be the fastest and most accurate way to set up a gauge. As we get deeper into marking gauge technique in just a couple of minutes, you'll see some other features that make this type of gauge the best choice in my opinion. I'll link to this gauge below because I know a lot of folks will be asking where I got it. So far, what we've discussed refers to the type of cutters on these gauges, but there are other important differences as well. These feature simple beams and single cutters, but these gauges have multiple cutters. This one features 2 beams, each with its own cutter. This one features a single cutter on one side of the beam, but dual cutters on the other side, which are adjusted by a sliding brass mechanism. And this gauge features 2 disc cutters that may be positioned individually on the beam. Gauges with dual cutters are designed for marking 2 lines at the same time, such as when laying out a mortise or a tenon. We'll get into that in a little bit, but let's talk about how to get accurate marks from any of these gauges. To begin with, you must decide how you will support your workpiece. If I'm marking down the edge of a board, I might place one end on the bench and push the gauge away from me. You may also reverse the cutting direction and pull the cutter towards you if that's more comfortable, or you may hold the board flat on the bench as you make your mark. I find this especially convenient when I'm marking the end of a workpiece. Note how the cutter is on the trailing side of the gauge. Both the fence and the beam are in contact with the wood at the start of the cut, and the cutter is dragging behind. Don't try to stand the cutter up on end. At that angle, you'll get a rough, inaccurate line. Place the fence against the edge, the beam against the surface, and then rotate the cutter until it comes in contact with the wood. Now, there's no reason to mark your line in a single pass. In fact, being too aggressive can cause the cutter to follow the wood grain, forcing the fence away from the edge of your board and creating a wavy line. So take a light pass, just scratching the surface of the wood. Then take another and another, creating your line with multiple passes rather than a single deep gouge. As you do, keep pressure against the edge of the board so the fence remains there. It won't be difficult with most materials, but if you're working with very coarse-grained wood, such as oak or ash, you may have more trouble keeping that fence from moving away from the edge as the cutter tries to seek the path of least resistance and follows the wavy grain. As I said, light passes will usually help, but another method is to start with the final inch or so of the line and then step back an inch, then another, and so on. Establishing a track through small steps will give the cutter less time to wander into open wood. Also, note how I'm holding the gauge. With this traditional style, I have my thumb on the beam and I'm holding the fence primarily with my index and middle fingers. The ring and pinky fingers are not really doing that much. I find this grip helps me to balance bulkier gauges like this, keeping the fence flat on the board's edge rather than letting it tip away. But I find a different grip more suitable for the modern disc style gauge. Here, I hold to the fence mostly. One of the reasons I'm able to do this, which I consider to be a more comfortable grip, and still keep the fence tight against the edge of the workpiece, is the nature of the cutting disc. The bevel is positioned facing the fence. As it cuts, this creates a wedging effect, which actually pulls the fence toward the edge of the board. This is a big reason why I prefer this style of marking gauge over the pin type. A knife type can also be set with the bevel toward the fence, but it can't do this. Pin and knife cutters force me to interrupt the cutting motion when going around a corner. A disc style may be rolled around the corner for a cleaner transition with no torn fibers along the edge. I also don't have to tilt the cutter into the wood at the beginning of the stroke as I do with other cutters. I just find the disc style so much more comfortable and convenient for a lot of reasons. I also like how this particular disc style gauge has a micro adjust feature that makes it easier to set up, particularly if you do need to set it to the marks on a ruler. Now that you know how to use a marking gauge, here are some more applications for it that you may not have considered. Obviously, you can use it to mark a line parallel to the edge or the end of a workpiece, such as when cutting rabbets, dovetails, or slip joints. You can also mark a line parallel to the surface of a workpiece, which is helpful if you're thickness planing, either by hand or by machine. If you're cutting mortise and tenon joints, you can set the dual pins to the thickness of your mortising chisel, your hollow chisel, or your router bit, and then use that to lay out your tenon cheeks. A marking gauge may be used to find the center of something. Just adjust by eye to get close, mark from opposite faces, and then split the difference between your lines. This is another place that a micro adjuster really pays off. This even works on turning blanks, and once you get it set, you can quickly mark the center of blank after blank after blank. And that's perhaps the biggest benefit of a marking gauge. The setup is perfectly repeatable. If you have to mark a bunch of work pieces with a ruler, error can easily creep in, but a marking gauge doesn't make those mistakes. I like to have at least 2 of them on hand so I can repeat more than one setup during a project. These particular ones I got from chipsfly.com, which is a sponsor. They're pretty inexpensive, so I can afford to have more than one of them on hand. As I said, I'll link to them below this video. We'll see you next time. Wait, don't go yet. If you're new here, please subscribe and remember to ring the bell. I would really appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up, or better yet, leave us a comment. I always read them. And be sure to check out the latest issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always packed with tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker.